Hello and welcome to our GCP-Mindset channel. Today I have an interview with my business partner and friend Jörg Mielebacher. And Jörg and myself, we will speak about software and clinical research, which should be interesting for everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, Jörg, thank you very much for being here to speak with me about software development and clinical research. And and we have developed already something together, and I'm a big fan of software development, but I consider our business, clinical research, actually as quite old-fashioned. We still do a lot without using software. But let's start with yourself. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about your history and experience you have with software development.
Thanks, Andreas. It's a pleasure being here. So I started in IT technology more than 20 years ago. I studied medical informatics and did my PhD in medical imaging. And I was always fascinated by medical technology. And we met almost 12 years ago, and you introduced to me a completely new field of software. Clinical research was absolutely new to me at that time, and we quickly developed an idea of how software could really improve processes in clinical research. And again, it's very fascinating, and I completely agree with you. There are still processes that seem very old-fashioned, and we are developing software to make it much more efficient and do the things much better than currently.
Thank you, Jörg. That's very impressive. Maybe you can tell me a little bit more on what kind of software development you have been involved already.
I was involved in a broad range of software. I did some work in enterprise resource planning, I did robotics, I did embedded devices, for example. I also did image processing many years ago. Currently, I am the head of PCQ Pilots, which does software development for clinical research. And there I'm also responsible for a broad range of software tools. We are covering tools for example, electronic trial master file, risk-based monitoring, randomization, ePro, and much more.
Jörg, let me ask you a general question. What would you think? In which cases does your software really perform better than people?
Well, from my point of view, it's rather a question of data versus software. I always see people struggling with their projects because they tend to do all work in a manual fashion. They don't collect data to base their decisions upon. So it's basically like flying through mountains when there is a lot of fog. And if they would take data to base their decisions upon, it would become more efficient and more effective because they would be able to direct their project by following the data. Software is superior in analyzing data because it enables you to focus on the small deviations, for example. Deviations that you wouldn't detect when you have to manually analyze the data. And besides that, software isn't tired at all. It does the same work in the same way every time, so it's reproducible. And this all makes software much better than people. But again, people still stick to using their manual processes, to use paper-based processes, for example, and they simply don't benefit at all from data that is already available.
Jörg, you said software is very stable, and that's what I also think. People have good days, bad days, and sometimes they are just not that concentrated during the work. But software is always working the same way, and that's a big advantage.
Absolutely. So if you look into a common office in clinical research, you see that people are diverted by phone calls, by colleagues and much more. They need to travel a lot, which makes them not perform the same way every day. And well, software is a key to have a reliable process, to process data in the same fashion, in a reproducible way. And this is crucial for clinical research. So we need to really focus on software in terms of building processes that are reliable and have data processed in the right way.
Yeah, completely agree. But could you, as a software expert, also imagine a situation where you would say people are better than software?
Of course, software fails whenever we are talking about creativity, for example. And there is some major progress, for example, in, let's say, communication. So we are seeing social bots, help desk assistants that are completely virtual. But communication in terms of projects still is very human-driven. So we need to communicate with each other, we need to develop a feeling of how, we could say how to read between the lines. And this is still done much better by people than by software.
Yeah. So the old values of people like negotiation, showing empathy, especially in our international business where we have the different cultures.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, but when we speak about clinical research and GCP as quality standard, we always need to keep in mind data integrity, data quality, and then it's of course logical that software is a very, very important tool for clinical research. But still, as I said already, our business is quite old-fashioned. A lot of people probably would not agree with us and would say, no, in former days, 20 years ago, everything was better when we went more often to the study sites to make 100% source data verification, and paper TMFs are more reliable than electronic TMFs, and the old randomization envelopes are better than the electronic randomization, and so on. Why is that the case? Are they just scared of new technologies, or what can you imagine?
Good question. Of course, people are always used to the processes they followed for many years, especially in clinical monitoring, where there are people of different skill levels and with different experience in clinical research, for example. When they realize that software really brings time savings, for example, that they really realize that software makes their life much easier, then they become more and more open-minded. We've seen that some years ago when we saw the first electronic CRFs. People were used to the paper CRFs, they had huge binders of CRFs, but when the first electronic CRFs appeared, they realized how easy it can be to access the data, to have data cleaning, to avoid, for example, typing data into databases and much more. So the ECRF brought a much more efficient way of handling data. And currently we are seeing the same trend when we are moving from paper-based TMFs to electronic TMFs. And some years ago we saw that binders need to be shipped from one country to another. We had to wait for the binders to arrive. And currently, everyone, even in multinational trials, is able to access the TMF from all over the world. So this offers a much higher level of quality in terms of trial management, and it really saves time because you don't have to ship the binders, you don't have to check paper. Everyone is able to access the TMF at the same time. And well, it's our job to actually make people realize the benefit software brings into clinical research. But again, clinical research is expensive, and software for clinical research has to fulfill various regulations, which makes it even more expensive. So we need to have good arguments for providing software at comparable higher prices, because we need to make clear that this software really offers a higher level of quality. And this is what we were just talking about when we were talking about human versus software. So software is able to detect deviations in a much reliable way, in a very reliable way. And this is what we expect in clinical research. So there are a lot of advantages towards software and clinical research, but it's the same as every time. People are used to their processes and they have to get comfortable with software in the first steps.
You just said that we have regulatory standards for software development, and you also said that it might be quite expensive to develop software for clinical research. And I think one important topic in terms of regulatory standards, and which also might have an impact on the costs, is validation. Maybe you can tell me, as a non-software expert, what is validation? I think even so, it's a very often used word. Not everybody knows what's validation and what kind of validation we have for different kinds of software.
Yes, so validation basically means that you provide evidence that a piece of software, exactly a system, is performing in the intended way. Software and system, this is one of the most common failures when using the term validation. So we are not only talking about software, we also talk about the system itself. So the system also includes, for example, the operators. When doing validation, it's important to provide evidence that the operator, the user, is able to perform its tasks in the intended way. And there are many different regulations towards clinical research software. It depends, for example, on the risk level. It depends on how software really is affecting clinical data. And it's crucial to have a validation plan, a validation master plan, how it's called. This plan describes how the system is validated. So, for example, we start with a specification. It's a document that includes all requirements. So, for example, if you click the red button, then this happens. And afterwards, we are checking if the system is really performing according to the specification. So someone needs to click the red button, and if it really does what is written in the specification, the test is regarded as being passed. Then we need to write a summary that collects all test results, and we must come to the conclusion that the system is ready to be used. There are many regulations. So, for example, we need to take into account Part 11 from the US FDA. We need to take into account GAMP, for example, and many different standards that apply to different pieces of software. There are guidance documents, for example, from the EMA. We used to read this guidance, for example, when we released a new release of our eTMF. So we need to check if our specification of the software really takes into account all requirements that are provided by the regulations. And this is a very time-consuming topic, and it requires some really expert knowledge. And sometimes the problem is that the regulations aren't really clear enough. Parts of those regulations have been written more than 20 years ago. They don't focus on nowadays problems, for example, web-based applications. There haven't been any web-based applications at the time they were written. So this makes it even more complicated when you're visited by an auditor, for example, each auditor could have or could see a different meaning of the requirement. So sometimes you simply have to change your view of the requirement in order to fulfill the regulations. And it's really complicated, but it's also a lot of fun. And it's a challenge that it's really interesting.
Okay, validation is of course a very important topic, especially for the QA people, auditors, inspectors. But there are of course also other decision makers when we ask ourselves, shall we invest into a new software? The CRO manager, vendor managers or financial controllers, and they are more interested in money. How
Absolutely.
expensive such software might be. And I was a couple of weeks ago in London on a conference and talked about software and clinical research. And there was a very interesting topic or question actually. They asked me, at which time is it better, so financially better to invest into software, and when are people better? Mm-hmm. And I couldn't give the answer. What would you answer as a software expert?
So in my opinion, I would say software is vital for clinical research nowadays. Companies that refuse to implement software-based processes won't achieve the same high level of quality at all. Besides that, we see that software makes life much more efficient. It's an experience we also have in our everyday life. We are using software, for example, in navigation. We are using software for electronic banking. It's part of our everyday life. And in our private life, we don't think too much about break-even analysis. Maybe we take into account security considerations, but the same applies to business life. Conducting a break-even analysis is quite difficult because you have to express benefits in terms of money. And how would you, for example, express a higher level of quality in terms of money? It's really difficult. You should also take into account client satisfaction or the repeatability of your processes. This is all done by software. And if you would like to conduct a break-even analysis, you first have to be able to express it in terms of money. And we won't see this happen, in my opinion. So we see that the whole industry is moving towards software-based services. And we simply can't refuse to follow this trend.
That of course makes sense. You as an expert for software development should of course also think about the next 10 years. Therefore, you probably already think about what kind of trends are existing, in which direction do we need to develop software in the next couple of years. Can you tell me where you see the trends in clinical research?
Yes, so again, I would like to focus on data. We are currently seeing a massive increase of the amount of data. Experts say that the global amount of data is doubling every 2 years. This is quite impressive because at the same time we need to analyze the data, and besides that, much of the data that is being created is unstructured. So for example, videos like this one, they need to be analyzed in order to gain benefit out of the data. So there are challenges towards data creation, and there are challenges towards analysis of data. If we first look at data creation, I'm pretty convinced that we will see an increasing usage of intelligent devices in clinical research. Again, we see the same trend in our private lives. So almost everyone is using such smartwatches that monitor your ECG or that track your sleep. And this is a very interesting device for clinical research, because if we are able to monitor the subject's ECG or the subject's blood pressure and much more, we are gaining insights on a 24-hour level. So no on-site visits can really achieve such level of detail. So intelligent devices will definitely be an important trend. And this will bring the hardware experts and the software experts together again. During the past years, we have seen that software is very important, and no one was talking about the hardware. But nowadays, we see again that hardware is getting important. So this is one part of the trend. If we are looking at data analysis, we see that people want to have real-time reports. They want to be able to customize their reports themselves. So ad hoc reporting is very important. But the really massive amount of data also require us to rethink data analysis. Of course, statistics will always be very, very important. But there are situations where we also need to take into account what is called artificial intelligence. So this itself involves technological challenges, but also introduces massive challenges for software validation. Because things like artificial intelligence itself, it's a black box. You sometimes don't know what happens inside. You enter the data into your intelligence and it answers. So if it says 42, you might wonder, why is there 42? You simply don't know. And this is in massive contrast to what we want to be able to conduct when we are performing software validation. In software validation, we want to know what happens. We want to see that the software is performing in the way it is specified. We don't want to be surprised. So data creation and data analysis, for example, by using artificial intelligence, those are two important trends. Besides that, there are some topics that exist for more than 20 years now, maybe 30 years. When I studied medical informatics, they were talking about electronic health records, and it's still a hot topic. But what I want to say is, currently we are using electronic case report forms. We are using them because someone needs to enter data from the health record into the CRF. It would be more efficient to simply extract the data out of the health record. And this can be done in an automatic fashion. We don't have errors due to transcribing values and much more. So this would be very interesting for clinical research. But to be honest, I don't know if it's really happening in the next 10 years. So we can really, it really remains interesting what's happening, and you know that software development is pretty fast. So there might happen new technologies that we even don't think about right now. So it's really a fascinating topic.
Jörg, you just mentioned one topic which you considered a hot topic, and I completely agree. It was a hot topic for the last 20 years already, the connection between patient records and ECF, which makes, of course, completely sense. But another hot topic was electronic archiving, especially now with the new European requirements to archive study data for 25 years. It makes sense to save paper, space, and so on. Do you think that we will find a solution to archive electronically? And do you think also that how long do we need until everybody accepted that we will be able to open files also 25 years later, or most people are still scared and want to archive everything on paper?
It's a good question. You mentioned 25 years. 25 years in information technology is centuries. So if you look back 25 years and ask yourself, well, what were the software tools I was using 25 years ago? I'm pretty convinced that none of the tools is still available right now. Or even the files that you created 25 years ago cannot be read today. Or the same applies to storage media. So just think about the floppy disks. I still have a floppy disk drive somewhere in my office, but I wouldn't be able to connect it to my computer today. So there's really big challenge in making software tools available for such a long period of time, but also to make hardware available for such a long period of time. But we can't refuse to implement electronic archiving because we rely on electronic tools in a massive way. So our whole business is driven by software tools. Therefore, we need to implement electronic archiving. But the question is, how can this be ensured? And of course, we can use files that follow open standards, PDF-A, for example. We can use software tools that are provided as open source, for example. This prevents you from running into a vendor login. So if the vendor decides after 10 years to stop developing the software, you're lost. But when you're using open source software, you still have the chance of modifying the software, of implementing security fixes, for example, of adapting the software for new operating systems. Because also the operating systems like Windows, Linux, and much more, they are having upgrades during that 25 years. So this all is very difficult, but we need to start with it. And of course, we might run into problems when we are starting now with focusing on a specific piece of archiving software, but we need to start. There is a pretty good experience in archiving when you're looking into the hospitals. In hospitals, you also have to archive the health records for 10, 20 or 30 years. And what they saw is that the demand of accessing archived data is massively decreasing over time. So there is a certain need of accessing health records during the first 5 years, of course. But the probability of accessing the same record again after 20 years is pretty low. So maybe a first strategy would be to focus on the first 5 or 10 years and to implement processes that copy the data to newer storage media, to newer software tools, for example, or simply to take into account that the risk of accessing less critical data can be omitted. So if you simply drop the data, this could also be a useful process. But the regulations are not ready for such strategies right now. They are driven by the way we were archiving data in the paper-based area.
And I think most people also forget that paper archives are also risky, especially when you have the GPs involved. They are old. Maybe they do not survive the next 25 years. Nobody is available at site.
Yes.
And I think then when you're using software on a server or media, it might be even easier to get access later on. Yeah.
Absolutely. You are able to copy data to a different data center.
Exactly.
If you would like to perform the same steps in a paper archive, it's becoming very expensive.
Yeah.
But in an electronic archive, you are mirroring data to the other end of the world. And so, if, for example, our data center is destroyed, then the data is still available on the other side of the world.
Yeah. And I also think that electronic space, it's getting cheaper and cheaper, whereas real space where you need to archive paper is getting more and more expensive.
Yes. Yeah. It's also an important point to consider. Of course, we also need to take into account the costs for running the data center,
sure,
for securing the infrastructure and much more. But the storage cost itself has decreased massively. And of course, the data is available in an electronic way. Why should we create printouts and put them into a paper archive? So no one really wants to do so.
Okay, Jörg, let's come to the last question, which I typically ask everybody. What would you recommend to organizations, CROs, or university clinics, or sponsors which are interested in software? They have old-fashioned processes, they are working more with paper, but they want to go the next step to use more software in clinical research. What's important for them? You as an expert, if they contact you and say, Jörg, we want to use more software in future, what would you say?
I would recommend to focus on strong partnerships. When you're in the process of implementing software-based processes, of developing software, for example, you need to rely on a software development partner. Establishing an own software development department is critical because the availability of software specialists is not that easy nowadays. Software specialists are expensive, and having only a single software specialist makes you rely on a single person, which is not the best idea, of course. So you should really establish good partnerships and try to find a partner that really understands the specific requirements of clinical research. If you need to tell your partner how to, for example, conduct validation activities or what monitoring really is, then it can be quite time consuming. So you need to find someone who understands the specific requirements. And you also mentioned the academic field. There I would also recommend not to rely on, for example, single students that develop complicated pieces of software. It's not a good idea at all, because they are leaving the university after half a year, 1 year or 2 years, at least when they finished their PhD, for example, or what else made them reside in the university. So you should maybe focus on open source tools, because they offer you a good trade-off between established software and the ability to look behind the scenes. So this can really be a good starting point. But again, you should always understand the regulations. You should understand that they are following the good old PDCA cycle. So try to implement reviews in your processes, try to plan, try to document everything. When you're conducting validation activities, try to provide as much evidence as possible. So add screenshots to your documents. Try to create test cases that are really useful, test cases that are based on risk levels. So not every piece of software follows the same risk profile. So understand the risk profile, conduct a risk analysis maybe before. And then focus on where you expect failure to happen. So it's a broad range of topics, but you will benefit from software. So if you implement software-based services, you will achieve a higher level of compliance, of quality, and also management of your company will improve because you gain much deeper insights into your own business. You understand where there are inefficiencies in your daily life. And by implementing software, you enable your team to focus on what they are really hired for. They can focus on, for example, communication. They can focus on innovation. So everything that software cannot perform the same way. And well, it's a piece of money that is needed in the first step. And of course, it's a process that never ends. But it really brings you a giant step further in your company's development.
Jörg, thank you very much. It was very interesting. And thank you also for your last recommendations. I like it very much. For me, it sounds like don't search for nerds, but for people who really understand your needs and who develop software according to our needs. So software should serve us, not we should serve software. Very important. Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. And I also hope that you liked our video, that you found it interesting. Please leave us your comments, send us your questions, and please subscribe us. See you the next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.